If I told you there's a prescription that you could write that would increase survival and quality of life, would you be interested? Oh, you knew better than this. If I told you that there's a prescription you can write that would increase longevity and quality of life, would you be interested? But wait, there's more. This treatment increases survival by 50% compared to those without this treatment. That boost in morbidity and mortality is on par with more well-established risk factors, such as smoking and alcohol consumption, and exceeds risk factors such as physical inactivity and obesity. By now you think, well, this must be difficult. I mean, have you ever tried to get someone to quit smoking or start an exercise routine? As the son of a physician, I remember all too frequently stories that my father would bring home, frustrations about his patients that he couldn't get to adhere to a medical treatment. And his frustrations are backed up by facts like 70% of all smokers want to quit, and 50% of all smokers try every year to quit, but fail. My prescription, however, is something that's easy to do and does not have any side effects, or at least not major side effects. And that prescription is interaction within a robust social network. There's no slides. Okay.
No slides.
Well, he said there's no slides. Okay, we can work with that. I thought I was going to be the one without technical difficulty. Yeah, I mean, I don't need them. I can do it without that.
Because you are a consummate professional.
Yes, okay. So basically, my argument here, without meaningful contact with other individuals, we put our health at risk. Your patients who don't have the ability to talk through both meaningful and mundane activities will die sooner than those who have that ability. So with my time today, I want to convince you that obtaining information about a patient's social network and continually monitoring the nature of that changing social network are both necessary for understanding the whole patient. I want to additionally explore the nature of a successful social network and characteristics of supportive relationships. So when I'm done, what I want you to have is a greater understanding of the importance of social relationships to health and well-being, and I want you to consider, if not mandate, that you include this metric as you obtain a patient's medical history. Aspects of medical history that are generally taught in medical education, particularly in the U.S., place a lot of emphasis on listening for key terms in order to obtain some sort of treatment options to diagnose. So we ask questions like, what brings you in today? What seems to be the problem? When did the symptoms start? And do you also have difficulty breathing? Right? We may have asthma or something, but not know it. In their study that involved extensive interviews with 55 patients, researchers at McGill University Medical Center found over half of respondents indicated that listening was the primary defining feature of a good doctor. And although their conceptualizations of listening were complex, one of the primary characteristics of good listening, something that separated competent from incompetent doctors, was this ability to listen in order to diagnose. Clearly, a healthcare provider's ability to diagnose is important. Running a close second to obtaining adequate medical history is the importance of physical examination prior to diagnosis and treatment options. So there are a multitude of instruments that are available for this. Indeed, medical professionals who fail to listen to us breathe or take our temperature will be seen as at least odd, if not incompetent in the eyes of most patients. Having 2 kids under the age of 10, and there's a cute picture of my kids now. I mean, as a good father, you see it and everybody goes, oh, thank you. No, that's right. So they're both, combined age under 10. I know it all too well. We go to the physician at least once a month. I was there last week with my 3-year-old, holding her hand as a physician, as a pediatrician, did the standard auscultation routine. And I'm not here to question those practices, but to suggest that the need to probe prior to prescribing is equally important for my prescription. In order to best prescribe modifications to a patient's social network, you've got to understand that network. At least in my experience, providing information about my medical history involves filling out forms that are often booklets, as we heard the gentleman talk about. And there's vast amounts of information about my health. When I was at the pediatrician last week, I was rattling off yes and no answers to a stream of questions about Lydia's past ailments. And we've all disclosed specific diseases that run in our family. Most of the forms that I've come across in my time, there are 80 specific diseases in very, very small print with little check marks by that you check off. I have or haven't had this. I do or I don't experience this. So there's lots of information that our medical providers get about our medical history. But we don't see the same amount of depth of information about our social networks. Even though knowing a patient's social network can tell you about their current health and their future health trajectory. People with fewer numbers of social contacts are more susceptible to the common cold. They're more likely to develop heart diseases like hypertension. They go to their physicians more often because of symptomology, and they have higher incidence of depression, anxiety, and overall less mental well-being. Information about a patient's social network is important medical information. The most common measure of whether I have some sort of contact with other people is to ask about my marital status. Marital status is certainly one way to look at social connection. And as Dr. Janice Tycolt-Glaser explains, if you're married, ideally, that's your closest relationship. That means there's a partner and a close source of support readily available. Unfortunately, not all partnerships are created equal. Presence is a necessary but not sufficient condition for being supportive. Backing up this is research that shows that being married or partnered in some sort of long-term committed relationship is more helpful for one of the partners than the other, and sometimes is negatively related to health for the other partner. Another person's presence is not a guarantee. There's a recent meta-analysis published in PLOS Medicine that found that simple measures like marital status are far less predictive of morbidity and mortality compared to what they call complex measures of social integration. And what this means for medical practice is the standard "are you married or not" question is simply not sufficient. And it's not sufficient just to add divorce as an option either. We need to treat people as members of dynamic social networks. And that's basically my thesis in a nutshell. To understand the whole patient, you have to understand that patient as belonging to a dynamic social network. There's two broad implications of this thesis. First of all, we have to assess an individual's social network using complex measures of social integration. You need to know how your patient is situated, not only with respect to her health and her health problems and her choices, but with respect to her supportive cast and crew. You've got to know more than whether she's married with kids. You've got to know if there's people in her network that she can go to for support. The second implication is that just as we continually monitor patients' health, if this cough gets worse, come back, we also have to monitor the changing nature of their social relationships. Just as our health can change both gradually and fundamentally, our social relationships change gradually, and we have instant fluctuations that are often traumatic. So I want to take up these two implications briefly. First, what's a complex measure of social integration? I want to propose that there's three components. You need to know the number of people in the network, the frequency of contact with those people, and, more importantly, the quality of that contact. The first two measures, number and frequency, are structural components of social support, but they pale in comparison to understanding the quality of the support that's available when needed. Usually when we talk about quality of support in the literature, we talk about a term called perceived support availability, which is you're thinking of, are there people out there that are supportive when I need to have when I have some sort of distress, or when I need to talk through some sort of problem. The belief that others are available and supportive can buffer the impact of stress. There's over 20 years of research that shows this is the case for both self-reported stress and physiological markers of stress. People who have other people in their social networks, they simply respond differently to stress. And so you need to have a complex measure. You also need to have this complex measure over time. There we go. Here's my slide. I have no idea where I am in. Here we go. Oh, there's people. All right, so basically, until 2 years ago, my wife and I were the only ones in our family with kids. And so that means everybody catered to our schedule. Christmas and Thanksgiving is like, when are you all going to be in town? We're going to be in town, and everyone was there. Now, my brother and sister-in-law, they have families. There are now 3 sets of schedules that we have to accommodate. which means things get tougher. There's less contact among the social group. We have 4 cousins rather than just the 2 grandchildren. So what does that mean for you? You've got to pay attention to these changing shifts in people's networks. And you have to pay attention on a more local level to the types of conversations that happen in your patients' lives. There's good research showing immunological changes as a function of receiving hurtful messages, especially when these messages are in response to some distressful event. And when those messages are in response to a positive event. Okay? So we both need people to lift us up when we're distressed and to help us capitalize on positive feelings when we're feeling joy. Perhaps most familiar to you, however, is the myriad sudden changes that often drastically change your ability to seek support. When a spouse dies or a good friend moves, we're left sometimes stranded with no one to turn to. So people are members of dynamic social networks. This means it's necessary to measure social networks as part of normal medical care, and there is a need to include a complex measure of social integration. It's not complicated by length. Most of these things are about 11 questions long, which pales in comparison to the 80 diseases that you measure in terms of health. And there's good reason to measure this. Social loneliness is one of the strongest predictors of relevant health outcomes. And by social loneliness or social isolation, I don't mean physical health or physical loneliness, that you live alone, which is oftentimes you live alone, right? My grandmother lives alone. She's 92 years old. My grandfather died in 2008. She's lived alone ever since. But my uncle lives in town with my aunt that comes by with my cousins and her 2 great-grandsons who live in town on a regular basis. She talks to my aunt who lives in Washington, D.C. once a day, and my aunt comes in twice a year. My mom goes up every weekend, and I also go up quite often, right? And the important thing here is the conversations that we have, it oftentimes doesn't matter what we talk about. It matters, however, how we talk about those things. When I go, we talk about that she had Davis catfish for lunch on Saturday, and that she saw somebody that she recognized in the grocery store, and that Alabama is doing horrible at football, and that she can't believe they haven't fired the coach. I mean, that's what we talk about, and then I fix her computer and I leave after coffee. But she talks about those conversations for weeks, right? So let me repeat that. It's not what you talk about, but how you talk about it. And I hope that some of you will come to the workshop tomorrow that I'm doing to talk through some of these issues about how it is that we talk to other people when they're distressed and when they're trying to capitalize on their positive